So out of interest, who had come across my survey before Adam posted out the link? Okay, that's cool. A few people. That's good. Well, as I mentioned, this is not the first time that I've run the survey. It's the third edition. The first one launched back in 2015. And as with each edition, they've been more or less 12 months apart. The exception was this year, because before then I was running it kind of like October, November time. And I ended up like rushing it out before Christmas and not really like having the most fun before Christmas. So I thought I'll do it in the new year and it'll give me plenty of time, which is why I moved it. But why did I start doing it in the first place? Well, before working at Just Eat, I used to work in London, and I worked for an agency with about 4 other front-end developers, and we helped to maintain an internal framework that we used for the majority of our projects. And we regularly discussed the tools that we thought that our framework should move on to and start using to make sure we kept up to date and the framework was kept up to date. But the biggest issue was that, while we'd like to keep up to date and we thought, we see a new framework and think it was really cool, or see a new tool that we might like to use, it was really hard to distinguish what was just generating a lot of noise and what was actually being used by people in the industry. So that's why I decided that it would be a really good idea to maybe put together something that might tell me some more results and actually give us something to quantify that. The discussion we had back then was actually like switching from Browserify to Webpack and whether we should do it. And because back in 2015, Webpack was still fairly new, we couldn't decide whether that was something that we should move towards. And I think one of the things that all developers should keep in mind really is that, especially when discussing tooling, it's not just what we personally use, and just because we work in a certain way, it doesn't mean that everyone in the room will be working in a certain way as well. And I think having a survey like this really helps to kind of show you different perspectives on how people are working. So with this in mind, I decided to put together the survey, and I asked developers on Twitter. That's how I started putting it out. That was the tweet back in August 2015. And I put it out on SurveyMonkey, that's how I wrote it, put together a blog post, pushed the link out to the usual sort of networks like Hacker News, Designer News, Echo.js, that kind of thing. And in a couple of weeks, I'd managed to get about 600 responses, which I thought was really good. I was quite happy with it. My aim was about, up to 500, and I thought that'd be pretty good, be a decent number. So I wrote up the results in a blog post. And it just so happened I was going away on holiday a couple of days, in a couple of days' time, and I decided I'd put the blog post live. I'll keep the survey open because obviously if people see the blog post, they might fill in the survey. And I went on holiday to Peru, which isn't the best place for Wi-Fi if anyone's been to Peru. So I put it live, got on my plane, and I didn't really think much more about it. Until I arrived in our first hostel, connected to the Wi-Fi, and at which point my phone started melting down from a load of app mentions that the survey had started getting on Twitter. So it turned out that a few people with fairly large audiences on Twitter had mentioned the results, because while it's quite hard to get people to actually share a link to a survey to fill in, because that's almost like begging, once you've got some information and you want to share it, it's super easy. Everyone wants to share, that this framework is bigger than that framework or whatever, really. So that was really awesome, but the not so cool part of that is that one of the biggest things that I've learned through doing the survey is if you don't plan for it doing a lot better than you kind of expect, you can get into a bit of trouble. So the reason I say this is that while SurveyMonkey was super awesome and they had a free tier that lets you get about 2,000 responses for free, once you hit that limit, they charge you for every single response that you go over that limit. So in just overnight, I'd managed to rack up about 100 quid's worth of SurveyMonkey fees, and that wasn't the best way to start my holiday. So that first year, I had to turn it off while I was on holiday because I couldn't really do much about it when I was over there, and I didn't really make the most of the publicity that it was getting. So we got about, I'll show you in a second, we got about 2,000 responses that first year, which is why it kind of, had 600, 2,000. It'd been great to have found out how many I could have got that first year. In future years, I've been really lucky that since I've been at Just Eat, they actually have a SurveyMonkey account, so I've kind of been using that, and that has no limit, which is really awesome. So we can actually see the full results coming through then. The other major thing that I've had to learn about fairly quickly that I didn't really think about when I started the survey is email subscriptions. And this is how email, it's not playing all the way through, but this is how email subscription services make me feel, basically. They make me want to smash up my computer. He's not doing it there so much, but what I didn't realize back then, again, if you use MailChimp's really, really awesome. But it's kind of the thing that MailChimp is built for is quite a low regular audience. So what I do when I run my survey is I run it every year, but it goes out to quite a high number of people now. I've got about 4,000 people on the mailing list. I don't email them the rest of the year. It's like 2 or 3 emails a year. But MailChimp's really good for if you've got about 500 people and you're emailing every single month, because it gives you about 1,000 to 2,000 people to send every month. So that's fine if you're just sending that one email every month. So in the second year, I actually had to get around it. I know this has been recorded and they'll probably sue me for this or something, but I put together 2 SurveyMonkey accounts because I went over that 2,000 and sent it out to 2 sets of people. But then this year that was unviable. I had 4,000 people that I had to find a different service. And I'm now using something called Email Octopus, which is really cool. It uses AWS. But that just means that I can pay a set fee. It uses AWS, which email accounts is virtually nothing. And it's about £10 a month. So I can just take that out for a month or two, pay £20 rather than like, I think MailChimp's subscriptions once you get past 2,000, sorry, is absolutely ridiculous. I'd have to pay about £120 just for that subscription, which is a bit crazy because although I've started to get a bit more, Wes Boss reached out to me last year to do an affiliate scheme, and I get some money back then to pay for certain aspects of the survey. Otherwise, I'm just running it on my free time. So I have to try and do it for as small a budget as possible, obviously. Now, looking at the number of responses in that first year, you'll see it went up to 2,028. And so I think it was 2,000, but those 28 people who went over, they're the people who cost me that £100, which is which is quite ridiculous, really. 2016 though, because I'd got some more contacts from the first year of putting those results out, it was a bit easier getting those responses, and I didn't actually leave the results open too long, and I left it to about 5,000. And then this year you'll see, with so far, I haven't published the results yet, so you're the first people to see these results, but I've got 5,097 people who filled it in so far, which is really cool. And every year it does get a little bit easier to kind of get some more contacts, because I've got contacts within newsletters now that I just kind of contact and they help me out with that sort of thing. I was actually saying to Adam though, it can be quite frustrating sometimes, and you realise how big websites can run sometimes, where they're more than happy, like I say, to publish the results once they're out, but then you go back to them and try to get them to publish the link just to a survey, please fill in, and they just, they're not interested until those results come out, which is a bit frustrating. So as you can see, I'm going to show you the results from these 5,097 people today. And I'm aiming to publish these in the next couple of weeks, so if you are interested in seeing the full results published, just keep an eye on my Twitter or my blog, and they'll be up in the next few weeks as well. And then what I usually do is a couple of weeks or about a month later, I'll update them with the full results if there's more people who answer it in that time. So yeah, the results. If any of you want to shout out what you think the answers are when I go through them, that's heartily encouraged. Some of them are quite predictable. What I would say is there's been a couple of big swings, which are probably quite predictable in terms of like the actual swing, but probably what I found was it was quite surprising to the amount of the swings, and some things which I'm sure you'll all be able to guess which one's the most popular each year. So starting at the top, the survey asks all respondents to rate their experience and their knowledge levels in CSS and JavaScript, as well as this is to give a bit more context around the rest of the answers, and means that you can filter each question by experience level, how long people have worked in the industry, and also how people rate their CSS and JavaScript levels. So it's good because you can look at if beginners are using tools more than experienced people, and which tools they're using as they're picking up JavaScript and CSS. And equally, you can look at if these bigger frameworks that we all know about are just being used by experienced people, or if they're being used by beginners as well. It's also important though to gauge the ability, like I say, with the knowledge levels. But you have to kind of quantify this a bit, because obviously if I ask someone if they're amazing in CSS, that's them rating themselves. You have to take that with a pinch of salt. But equally, you kind of expect if someone says they're an expert, they probably aren't a beginner. So it gives you a vague idea of what people's knowledge levels are, at least. So looking at this year's respondents, over 54% have been working in the industry for over 5 years now, which means the majority of people filling out the survey this year have a fairly high level experience in front-end technologies. So you can see not that many people have less than 2 years experience, and once it goes over that, it's the majority of people really. Comparing this to the results of last time I ran it, so this is obviously, I ran this about a month ago, I closed the survey, and the results in 2016 came out in December, so there's about 14 months difference. But it's actually remarkably similar. So, although I'm not sure you can draw loads out of this because you might get different samples of people. I thought it was quite interesting to see almost exactly the same split. But what I did think, looking at this, is that perhaps there's not a massive influx of new people coming into the industry and filling out surveys, and whether this is because we're not getting lots of new people picking up CSS and JavaScript, or just that they're not into filling out surveys. It's hard to tell, but read into that whatever you want. These become more interesting as we go through and filter based on these sort of yearly experiences as we go through the different questions. Looking at how respondents rated their knowledge in CSS and JavaScript, there's also a similar pattern to last year's results, where about 60% of people consider themselves to be either advanced or expert in CSS, compared with about 53% saying the same with their JavaScript skills. So obviously, as with any question regarding knowledge, like I say, it's quite subjective, but what you can kind of gauge from this is that people probably consider that CSS is slightly easier to become an expert or more advanced in, because more people are taking that view and filling that out and saying that. But either way, like I say, the vast majority of respondents consider themselves to be at an intermediate level or higher in both CSS and JavaScript, and not many people are saying that they're beginners or novice. The vast majority of both of these charts are saying that they're at least intermediate level. I'll refer back to these, as I say, as I go through the different questions, especially the experience levels, because I think it's quite interesting to see what people are actually using. So the first, I know I'm in a JavaScript name meetup, but I'll start with all the CSS stuff and get onto the JavaScript stuff later. But I asked people what CSS preprocessors they use, and I'm sure most people will probably be able to guess the results of this one because it hasn't changed quite so much. Does anyone want to? Yes. So this one's probably one of the most stable ones that, in terms of usage. In fact, I didn't think Sass usage could get too much higher, but it actually went up about 2% since last time. I thought it might stay about the same or even go down, but it hasn't. No preprocessor did actually go up a little bit as well. The only other ones other than Sass to go up were post-CSS and no preprocessor. All of the others actually went down, and I think less usage went down about 4%, which was quite interesting. I think this can be a little bit of an unfair question in some ways, because a lot of people do use post-CSS as well as Sass, myself included. But as you say, I kind of word the question, say like if you had to pick one, then go for it. But I might look at in future years trying to see if people use multiple tools as well, because I think that'd be quite interesting, and post-CSS might actually start to climb, I think, then. But usage of post-CSS actually, since I started the survey back in 2015, has slowly grown, and as you'll see from the knowledge levels in this one, you can see the blue is people feeling comfortable in, and this level here has actually gone up consistently as well over the last few years, although Sass is by far the most the tool that people feel most comfortable using. The next question I asked was actually a result of feedback from developers asking me to include this. So this wasn't something that I kind of thought it was a tool, but I was like, oh, shall I put frameworks in? Everyone knows that people use Bootstrap. How much do I want to like vindicate Bootstrap people? So I was like, oh, I'll see. But so I asked people, which of the following CSS frameworks do you most frequently use? And what I actually thought, although I thought Bootstrap would be very popular, I was actually quite surprised by the split of how people were using frameworks, and it was quite interesting actually. So it turns out that it's actually incredibly close, that Bootstrap does come top. But if you take out the fact that people who aren't using a framework or custom frameworks, and then you split out all the other frameworks, it's actually about the same. So the people who are either doing their own thing or not using anything is about the same as all the people using frameworks, which I think was quite interesting, because I thought Bootstrap might actually kind of override a lot of that. And there's actually an incredibly high number using custom frameworks as well. If you actually start to drill down into experience levels, this actually goes up quite dramatically as well, with 48% of people starting out with about a year's experience use Bootstrap. So that goes up, 14%. So people who are learning CSS obviously are going to Bootstrap rather than just learning CSS, which I think most people would probably guess, but it's interesting to see that quantified in the results as well. And this figure actually drops to 30%, so only 30% of people use Bootstrap with over 5 years experience. 53% of those developers either don't have a preferred framework or use their own custom framework, over 53% as well. So that I think it comes to about 48%. That goes over the 50% if you look at people who with over 5 years experience. So it seems, as I say, probably not too surprising, but the more experienced you become, the less likely you are to use an off-the-shelf framework, and the more likely you are to either use a custom framework or to use no framework at all, which I think, again, natural, but it's good to see it in the figures that it's kind of reflected like that as well. CSS naming schemes next. So this is something that I really like, CSS naming schemes, quite passionate about them. And I started asking this last year just out of interest to see if people actually do use them. I didn't ask for specific usage in this. I asked about BEM and tools like that later. This is just more, do you use a naming scheme at all? Just to kind of get knowledge levels of naming schemes at all in the first place. So looking at the results, the number of developers using a naming scheme has gone up since the last survey. So you can see it's gone up 4% since the 2016 survey. And the people who have heard of naming schemes but don't use them has also gone up. But at least the people who have not heard of naming schemes has actually gone down, which I think is quite good, because a tool that helps you with your maintenance of your CSS, it's good to see that overall percentage of people at least knowing about it and reading about it going up. And I think they are really useful as well, so it's also quite encouraging, like stuff like testing, to see these sort of trends getting picked up by people coming through as well. Similarly, the next question was about CSS Linting. And last year, about 46% of people said that they linted their CSS. So do you think that number's gone up or down since last year?
Down.
Cool. Higher, lower. It's actually gone almost bang on 50%. so it's gone up from 46% up to 49.9%. So we're almost at like the point now where more people lint their CSS than don't, which is again awesome, because one of the things I was most surprised at last time I ran the survey was the number of people who hadn't heard of a tool called StyleLint, which is absolutely awesome. If you haven't heard of that tool, it's basically, a lot of people think of CSS Linting as the old style tools that give you so many rules that you just don't want to stick to. StyleLint is a bit more like ESLint and things like that, where you can just pick the rules that you want. And so you don't have to abide by all of the random CSS rules that old tools like CSS Lint tended to put in place. So again, it's really useful to it's really good to see this trending upwards at least. And I think that, again, if you haven't looked into this sort of thing, I'd definitely recommend it, because it gets rid of a lot of we found using it Just Eat, it gets rid of a lot of really niggly code reviews things that you just don't want to mention, that it just takes care of all that stuff. The next question was all about new and shiny things in CSS. So although these aren't strictly tools, I was really interested to see, there's so much noise about CSS Grid, custom properties and things like that. I really wanted to know how many people were actually starting to use these things. So I thought I'd put it in as a question in the survey. So the question asked was, how would they rate their experience level with Grid, Flexbox and custom properties? And the results were actually pretty interesting. So you can see Flexbox now, a huge number of people found that they were comfortable with Flexbox. 68% of people said that they were comfortable with it, which goes to show that Flexbox has been around for quite a while now, but people are actually really do feel comfortable with the syntax and actually using it in projects by the looks of it. I was quite surprised that custom properties actually had 19% of people who felt comfortable using it, and CSS Grid only had 18%, which I thought Grid it's had so much noise over the last 6 months. I mean, if you look at the used a little, it does wipe the floor with custom properties. So it does, lots of people are getting into it and starting to learn it. But I thought that was really interesting, because I didn't think custom properties, although it's coming through, hasn't had quite the number of, the amount of push as CSS Grid has. But it looks like all three of them are actually, people have used them at least a little bit, or they're at least hearing about and reading them. And Flexbox, if you're not already using it, it looks like that if you went to a job interview today, you'd be pretty much expected to know about it, because a lot of people are using it now. So my final CSS question was around CSS methodologies. And this is about finding out what actually people use, like I was mentioning about the naming schemes, stuff like BEM, auto prefixer, tools like that help you in your CSS, and methodologies that might help you as well. So this is stuff like smacks and things like that you might know if you're into your CSS. So what did the results look like for this? Well, like last year, the tools that were most popular were still up there as well. So stuff like auto prefixer, BEM got quite a high result. So this is multi-choice, by the way, so people can name as many of these that they use in their projects. And then closely followed by, so you've got auto prefixer, BEM, modernizer, which you probably all expect those to be quite high. And then CSS modules actually, if we'll show you the table in a second, but that has come massively up in the last 14 months. And stuff like style lint, again, I said last time I think it got about 8%. I'm going to show you the table in a second, I'll confirm it. But that's starting to get knowledge levels of people actually really using that now, and it's really encouraging to see tools like that come through. What was interesting as well was that although Atomic Design held true, and it was about 15% of usage, that's about the same as last time, a lot of the other CSS methodologies has actually dropped down. So this was the full table, like I was saying. So you'll see that auto prefixer and BEM, their knowledge levels, usage levels have gone up. Modernizer had actually dropped about 9%, which is interesting. People obviously feeling like they don't need Modernizer as much anymore. But CSS modules and style lint have gone up 10% and almost 9%. Respectively, which I think is quite interesting and shows a trend upwards for those. And as we go into some of the other tools later, you'll see CSS and JS get mentioned as well, a bit later as well. But yeah, like I said, stuff like SMAX and object-oriented CSS had actually dropped off quite considerably. I think this is probably where CSS modules is probably taking the place of those, and people are using more CSS and JS and flipping for those rather than the more architectural patterns. And so people coming in, I think Atomic Design is still quite well promoted out there. There's still some people who really push it, but I think the other ones are kind of falling by the wayside a bit as new people come through. They're probably not the first things you hit as you learn CSS. Right, so. That's the end of the CSS kind of stuff. But we're now firmly into JavaScript and tooling stuff now. So the next question I wanted to show was for task runners. So I don't include Webpack in this just because I include Webpack as a bundler rather than a task runner, which is kind of it's hard to quantify. Webpack does everything, so it's, you can't include it in all the questions. But people can include it in other if they really feel like it as well. But this is more about Gulp, Grunt, NPM scripts, that kind of thing. So this historically was a question that Gulp had been pretty dominant in. Grunt usage had trended downwards, and Gulp had kind of taken over a lot of what Grunt had let go. And NPM scripts looked like they were becoming more popular when I did the survey last. This was one of the ones I was massively surprised by the swing, actually. So NPM scripts had like absolutely wiped the floor with all of the others. I mean, it went up 22% since last time, which actually when I dug down into the results, it was a lot of the beginners actually, rather than going for a tool, they were actually going for NPM scripts, which kind of makes sense that if you're learning JavaScript and you're learning NPM and that kind of thing, rather than picking up a tool, you might go for the most, one of the simpler ways of doing things, and that is NPM scripts. Actually, the people with under 2 years experience, that went up slightly to, I think went up to about 50%. So they were above the average, where the other developers were still using some of the other tools. So Gulp usage, although still pretty high, I mean, there's still about a third of people are still using Gulp, so it's not low by any means. It did drop 14% though since last time, compared to NPM scripts going up 22%. And that is quite a big swing. And I think this is probably down to a bit of tooling fatigue as well, people wanting to simplify things in their task managers and feeling like they don't necessarily need to use something like Gulp, which, and switch into NPM scripts, like I say, for beginners. In terms of module bundlers as well, so this does include stuff like Webpack, Browserify, JSPM, all of the stuff that bundle up your JavaScript at runtime. As you would expect, it's not a massive surprise, but again, Webpack now is hugely, hugely dominant. 66% of people, so that's more people using Webpack now than are using Sass, which is pretty massive, really, massive percentage of people responding that way. People not using a bundler went down, and a lot of them obviously started using Webpack because that's where a lot of the results went. And things like JSPM, I don't know if anyone follows JSPM, but it's been in beta for like the last 18 months. I really wanted to use JSPM, but we can't use it in production while it's in beta, and they just can't seem to get it out. It's a really cool tool, so whenever it does get released, it might get some traction. But I think Webpack now is, by far and away the biggest module bundler now. In terms of the experience levels as well, so this was looking across task runners and bundlers. So you can see, even though gulp usage has gone down, it's still very widely known. So if you use it and you hire someone, chances are, about 50% of people know how to use gulp. So there's no worries in terms of that if you like using it. Again, a third of people use it, 50% of people know it. It's not a bad thing by any means to use it, right? But NPM scripts, the knowledge levels are really on the up. And like I say, this trends back to the other survey where last year, where a lot of people this year compared to last year are now using NPM scripts, and the knowledge levels are going up. I was a little bit surprised actually about Parcel, because I'd heard a lot of things about Parcel, and so I was really like, in previous surveys when I haven't heard about a tool and I hear a lot of noise, I think like Vue last time, even though Vue didn't do tremendously well last time, it was clear it was trending upwards. Whereas Parcel, I heard a lot about, and it didn't do particularly well. So I was like, yeah, there you go. It is a lot of noise to a certain extent. So this is probably one of the most interesting questions in the survey. It is around survey tool frameworks and JavaScript tools. And so there are three main questions in this. The first one is around which libraries and frameworks do people have experience in. So people respond if, like I said, like the other ones, like whether they feel comfortable in them, whether they know them a little bit, or whether they just read about them and that kind of thing. And looking at this graph, hopefully you can all see that it's quite a big graph. This is kind of split out into different chunks. And the blue ones, the blue columns are what people feel comfortable in. Used a little is the lighter blue, and it goes down as throughout each of them. And you can see predictably 80% of people feel comfortable using jQuery. What's really interesting about that number is actually that's down 6% from 14 months ago. And what's really interesting about that is actually when you drill down into the results and people with less than 2 years experience, only 50% of people actually felt comfortable using jQuery. So, which is really bizarre, right? Because you think beginners would be picking up jQuery, but it turns out they're not. And as you'll see as we go through the results to the other questions, actually more beginners were saying that React was important to them than jQuery, which was massively surprising. I thought that jQuery would still be, out of all of the kind of cross sections of people. But I thought it was really interesting that beginners literally weren't feeling comfortable in using it. They were just not feeling, they just weren't learning it. And even though a lot of them had used it a little, read about it, they weren't saying that they felt comfortable using it, which was really interesting to me because I thought that would be one of the tools that they would genuinely, obviously, know quite well. Out of the other tools, the most well-known were obviously then React. React came second. Lodash, which is far and away, as you'll see through some of the usage stats, it gets a lot more score than Underscore does. And then Angular 1 actually beats Angular 2 Plus like it did last time. So I thought that Angular 2 Plus might actually gain some more traction of people coming over from Angular 1, but it doesn't seem like that's actually happening, and it hasn't grown massively since the last survey. Vue actually did quite well as well compared to last time, and it saw quite a big upswing, and as we'll go through the other questions, you'll see that sort of pattern repeated. So the second framework question then asked, which tool do you currently use most frequently? And again, this is multiple choice, so you don't have to pick one. If people use jQuery and React, they can choose both. It's fine. So what were people frequently using on their projects? And you can see jQuery just about nicks it, but if you look back to the old survey, what's really interesting about this is that swing from last year's, 14 months ago survey, jQuery was up at 70% and React was down at 35%. So that swing is like about 30% in 14 months, which is pretty incredible that, people are just, dropping away from jQuery and moving over to React. And again, if you look at this with the people under 2 years again, these averages were actually going up for React in those categories, which is really interesting to me because I thought, again, that would be one of the ones that more people would be using jQuery in. So comparing it to the last set of results, jQuery had almost double the responses last time, and now it's literally down to about 3%. I think the second thing that's really interesting though is the Vue usage. So that was down at 23%. This is actually more than double than last time's survey, which was, I thought that Vue usage would go up, but again, it's gone up quite a lot. And usage is almost more than both Angular 1 and Angular 2 Plus combined, which is quite impressive for a tool that's not been around anywhere near as long as them. And you could arguably say, if you look at the next question's results, that it's probably now the second most popular framework. So again, here are the swings. So you'll see jQuery went down almost 20% since last time in terms of whether people frequently use it on their projects. And React went up about 11%. Underscore usage went down and Lodash went up. So you can see Lodash is pretty much, if people are reaching for a utility library now, that's the one. And I think it's probably because it's a lot more modular and it's a bit more performant than underscore. So people are naturally going towards that as they're making their applications more modular. Angular 1 usage is going down, but Angular 2 usage isn't going up as much compared to the Angular 1 usage going down as well, which I thought was quite interesting. The final question is what the developer actually considers the most essential thing that they're using on the majority of their projects. So this one, they only get to pick one. And if they can choose nothing, so they can say nothing's essential, or they can pick one of those frameworks or tools. And this was really interesting again. So the results here are confirming the trend really. React is now considered the most essential tool to the most number of developers answering this survey. So last year jQuery was top with 32%. It's actually fallen down behind nothing. So people consider nothing more useful than jQuery potentially. But still, not to be like down on jQuery because I think it's a really cool tool. A lot of people are still finding it useful, right? So there's still 20% of people who consider it the most essential tool, which if you compare it to a lot of the other tools, is still an incredible amount. It's still only 10% behind React. I think the negative for it is that it's trending downwards, and so it's it's lost about 12%. So again, if you look at the swings, you can go back if you want to take a picture. You'll also see the other interesting thing about this that I was saying about the old question. So if you look at Vue, more people consider Vue to be essential to them than either than Angular 2+, which is it's quite a substantial amount bigger as well. So again, like I said, it's probably considered now the second biggest framework. And like I say, the swings, you'll see React gained about 11% in this question, and jQuery dropped about 12.5%. So, it's quite big swings. Again, although React was coming through, I didn't think the swings off jQuery and into React would be quite as large. But again, if you filter down into the experience levels, the people with under 2 years experience were actually averaging above the average, whereas I thought they'd be below the average of React. So, whereas that was 28%, people with under 2 years experience was about 30%. So more people with under 2 years experience considered React to be essential to them than the average, which is incredible. I thought that was really interesting to kind of see that come through. So I think the one thing you can kind of take away from that is that it looks like people who are starting to pick up JavaScript are starting with things like React now. And that's what they're heading straight into, as much as native, because obviously the people saying none are essential is also going up. So on to the last few questions. These are around just some stuff that people might use around JavaScript. And although some of these might be quite obvious, hopefully, to people in the room, where the trends are going, I still think it's quite interesting to look at the data for them. So the first one was about transpiling, and I added this question last year because Babel was being quite highly used, and I thought it was interesting. And Babel usage last year was just about coming through. It was just over 50%. This year, lots and lots of people are transpiling their code, as it turns out. So like I say, I think it was about 60% last time. It's about 77.5% now. And the people who haven't last time out, people had not even heard of transpilers, and that's going down. And the people who have heard of it and haven't used it is also going down. So more people are transpiling their code. And this is, as you can see, it's one of the biggest percentages in the actual survey. It's actually becoming really industry standard to use a tool like Babel. JS unit testing as well. So this is obviously asking people if they use a unit testing tool and what they use. So this was actually what made the survey in the first year go, people start mentioning it, because it turned out that not many people were unit testing their code, and though everyone was up in arms and why is no one unit testing, and but actually since then, the last survey, it did actually break through 50% of people unit testing, and this year Jest seems to be like winning the hearts of developers, and it's swung up massively in terms of usage. So it's gone up 18% since last time out. So Jest is actually it's the tool I've used actually. I never really used testing tools before, but I found Jest like incredibly easy to set up, and this is probably why it's doing so well. I think it's a lot more user friendly than some of the old tools like QUnit and stuff that might be a little bit historically harder to get into. Still, quite a few people don't use a tool to test their JS, but not 50% of people at least. 43% of people don't. But equally, I don't think that's like those people need to be extricated and pitchforked, because at the end of the day, you don't need to necessarily unit test all of your code. If you're in an agency and writing a project for a month, you might not. Whereas if you're writing a massive application that's going to change over years and years, it's probably a better idea to unit test your code, because then it's a lot more robust. So yeah, but it's good that this is trending down though. So the people not using unit testing tools are actually going down, and those knowledge levels are going up. And the final question. So this was the first time I asked this question as well. And this is more because I use Yarn. I was really interested to see if people use Yarn. So it was a bit of a selfish one. But again, just interesting to see the results. So there's nothing to compare to last time. But NPM usage is still really, really high. So Yarn is 30%. NPM is about double that, which, quite interesting. I thought it might be a little bit closer. But I suspect if you'd asked this a year ago, then hardly anyone would be using Yarn. So I imagine then, if you looked at the swing, it would be a lot higher. It'd be interesting though, now that NPM seems to be doing a lot of things that Yarn is looking to do, it'd be interesting if this stays the same or swings either way. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see those results next time out. So that's the majority of the results that I can go into today. I think there's some really interesting stuff, especially around the framework stuff, like I say, and how people are getting into JavaScript. I'll be publishing the results in the next couple of weeks in full on my blog. If you've got anything that you specifically want to ask in terms of I haven't published them yet, so if there's things that you want me to dig into and I can look up, I can look into the results and try and include them in the actual results as well. So if you want to find out how many people in a certain range or certain knowledge level are using certain things, I can definitely either tweet you guys back or put it in the results for sure. But yeah, thank you for having me, and yeah, good.